They said Elias Whitlock was born with charcoal on his fingers and silence in his throat. In Fairhaven, Tennessee, people whispered his name the way they whispered of storms, quiet, uneasy, waiting for something to break. He was only a boy, thin as a reed and pale as chalk, yet his sketches unsettled the town more than any sermon of hellfire. Elias drew angels. Dozens of them, wings wide, robes flowing, shadows stretching, but none had faces, and before long, neither did the children in their graves. Elias Whitlock lived in a weather-beaten house that leaned against the wind like an old drunk against a wall. His mother scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled, but the smell of damp wood and mildew clung to every room like a curse. In the upstairs loft, Elias sat cross-legged on the floor with a stub of charcoal, black dust smearing his small hands. He filled page after page with figures that looked like angels, though there was something wrong with them. Their wings stretched too far, their fingers too long, their robes seemed to melt into shadow, and their faces, there were never faces. Where eyes, mouths, and noses should have been, there was only white emptiness, as if the paper itself refused to yield to his touch. His mother, weary and hollow-eyed, told neighbors that the drawings kept him quiet, that they were harmless as prayers. But in town, whispers carried faster than the river's current. Mrs. Rowe, who sold flour at the mill, swore she had seen one of Elias's angels drift across her parlor wall when the lamps were low. Another woman claimed the sketches moved at night, their wings shifting when no one watched. At the schoolhouse, the teacher found his slate covered in faceless figures, though he swore he had left it blank. The children laughed nervously, but none would sit beside him. Only Elias never laughed. He would tilt his head as if listening to some far-off voice no one else could hear, then scratch out another angel. By the end of that autumn, he had filled a stack of papers so high his mother had to hide them under her bed. And still he drew, his eyes wide, his lips barely moving, as if whispering to someone unseen. When asked what he was sketching, Elias gave the same answer each time, in a voice so soft it barely stirred the air. "What watches us?" he said. The day the widow came was colder than it should have been for early spring, the kind of day when the air seemed thin, as though it had been stretched too far. Elias sat on the porch steps with charcoal dust streaked across his cheeks, his hands blackened as if he had been digging in soot. His mother tried to scrub them clean, but he only went back to the papers, back to the faceless angels that seemed to crowd every corner of the house. That morning, Widow Harker arrived, carrying a box no larger than a loaf of bread. Her veil fluttered in the wind, though the air was still, and her shoes left no sound on the dirt path. She said nothing as she set the box down on the step, only fixed Elias, with eyes that seemed pale and wet, like glass marbles left in the rain. His mother tried to refuse, insisting they had no need for charity, but Widow Harker shook her head. "I have no more use for them," she whispered, her voice rasping like the turning of dry pages. When Elias opened the box, his mother flinched. Inside lay sheets of paper that seemed too brittle to touch, browned and crumbling at the edges, along with quills carved from strange bone and a small jar of ink blacker than tar. Elias's eyes widened as though he had found something long lost, something that had been waiting only for him. He pressed his fingers to the pages, and though they looked fragile, they did not tear. That night, he began to draw as if the paper itself was commanding his hand. His mother awoke near dawn to the sound of scratching upstairs, like rats in the rafters. When she climbed the narrow staircase, she found Elias hunched over the widow's paper, the ink jar nearly empty, his hand moving faster than seemed possible for a child. Around him lay a circle of pages, each marked with an angel so stark it seemed to shimmer against the candlelight, their wings bent low as if shielding something, and their faceless heads tilted downward, waiting. His mother snatched at the quill, but Elias held it tightly, whispering words she could not understand. The flame of the candle guttered and nearly died, though there was no draught. Widow Harker was not seen again in town after that night. Some said she left, others that she took ill, but no one knocked at her door. It was Elias who kept her memory alive, filling page after page with angels that seemed darker, sharper, more insistent than before. His mother hid the box under the floorboards when she could bear no more, but Elias always found it. He always found it, as though the gift had not been given, but returned. And from that night onward, the house seemed heavier, as if the walls leaned closer to listen while the boy drew. The schoolhouse in Fairhaven was a lean structure of clapboard and stone, its single bell cracked but still ringing out each morning with a hollow, uneven toll. Elias walked there with his head bent low, carrying his slate in one arm and the widow's paper tucked carefully under his coat as if it were more precious than his own breath. Inside, the children whispered the way dry grass whispers before fire takes it. They whispered about his hands stained black, about the drawings they claimed to have seen when the lamps burned low, about the angels without faces. No one sat close to him, not even the bold boys who prided themselves on teasing everyone. They gave Elias a wide berth, their laughter sharp and nervous, as though too near a sickness that could spread with touch. When the teacher called for copy work, Elias opened his slate, and without looking around, without hesitation, he drew. The other children scratched their letters, but Elias's hand moved swiftly, filling the board with tall forms in robes that stretched like roots through soil. By the time the teacher turned to collect their work, Elias had covered the slate with angels, each more twisted than the last, their faceless heads bowed together like a council of shadows. The teacher froze, his mouth tightening before he rubbed the drawings away with his sleeve, leaving only smears of gray dust. But the children had seen, and their whispers grew sharper. That afternoon, little Ruthie Blackwood swore that when Elias passed her desk, the figure in his drawing had leaned down, its blank face close to hers. She went home, pale as chalk, and her mother kept her from lessons for a week. The murmur spread beyond the walls of the schoolhouse. Parents spoke at supper tables, lowering their voices so children would not hear, though children always do. They said Elias was touched by something unclean, that he was listening to voices not meant for human ears. Some claimed he had no shadow when he walked across the yard. Others that the angels were not angels at all, but something older, dressed in stolen wings. Elias himself never argued. He never denied nor confirmed. He only bent lower over his slate, his lips moving as though he were repeating lessons no one else could hear. The teacher, a man who had once prided himself on discipline, stopped calling Elias to the board. He let him sit in silence, as if hoping invisibility might settle the matter. But invisibility never settled anything in Fairhaven. By spring's end, children told tales of hearing scratching at night, like chalk against glass, and when they looked from their windows, they swore Elias stood outside in the yard, though he was gone by dawn. It was then that the schoolhouse murmur grew into something sharper, something that began to turn the town itself against the boy. The first loss came quietly, without warning, like a candle snuffed out in the middle of prayer. It was little Mary Ellen Harrow, no more than 7 years old, who had shared her slate with Elias once in the schoolhouse when he had forgotten his. She had laughed nervously at his angels, whispering that their robes looked like bedsheets left too long on the line, though she never joined in when the others mocked him. That night, her father found her lying stiff upon her straw mattress, her eyes wide open, her lips parted as if to speak, though no sound came. There was no fever, no rash, no cough to explain it, only the stillness of her chest and the emptiness of her gaze. Her mother wailed until her throat cracked, insisting she had heard a lullaby drifting through the window just before dawn, though she could not say whose voice it was. In the schoolhouse the next morning, the children spoke of it in hushed tones, their small bodies trembling as though the frost had crept into their bones. They remembered how Elias had filled his slate the day before with a figure that bore a ribbon, just like the one Mary Ellen had worn in her hair. The ribbon in the drawing had been dark, though the real one was pale blue. When Elias came through the door, the chatter died. He took his seat without a word, pulling from his coat another page from the widow's paper, the ink lines already darkening with the form of a faceless angel. The teacher, pale and trembling, snatched it from his desk and stuffed it into the stove, but though the fire licked at its edges, the figure refused to curl or blacken. Only when the paper was torn apart by hand did the flame finally consume it, and even then the room reeked of iron, as though blood had been spilled. At Mary Ellen's funeral, the church was swollen with silence. The Reverend read scripture with a voice that shook, while mothers clutched their children tighter, eyes darting toward the back, where Elias sat beside his own mother. He held nothing in his hands, but every so often his fingers twitched, as if still holding a quill. When the coffin was lowered, a gust of wind scattered the hymn books, and for a moment the sky seemed to darken, though no cloud passed over the Sunday. Later, when her father stumbled home, he swore he saw a figure kneeling at the foot of her empty bed. Wings arched wide, head bowed, it vanished when he cried out, leaving only the faint mark of charcoal upon the quilt. From that night forward, no parent let their child sleep without a candle burning, though many said the flame did little good, for in the quiet hours before dawn, when the crickets hushed and the air turned sharp, it was not the children's voices that carried through Fairhaven, but the faintest echo of lullabies, sung by something without a mouth. Mary Ellen's father was not a man given to fancy. He had worked the mill for 20 years, his hands thick with callus, his back bent from hauling sacks of grain. When neighbors spoke of omens or spirits, he spat in the dirt and told them hard work was the only truth worth knowing. But after his daughter's death, something in him cracked, and he began to speak of what no one wished to hear. On the night Mary Ellen slipped away, he had risen from bed to fetch water. Passing her room, he caught sight of something that froze him where he stood. A figure knelt at her bedside. Its wings spread so wide they brushed the walls, feathers dark as ash. Its robe pooled across the floor like spilled shadow. The thing bent close over her, humming a tune that rasped like a lullaby sung through stone. Where a face should have been, there was only blankness, a smooth white surface that caught the lamplight and reflected it back like glass. He had stood there, paralyzed, until the figure turned. Though it had no eyes, he felt its gaze press against him. With such weight, he staggered, clutching the doorframe. Then, as quickly as smoke leaving a chimney, it was gone. Only the stillness of the room remained, and the sound of his child's last breath rattling from her chest. When he told the Reverend, the man frowned deeply, urging him not to repeat the story, lest grief drive the whole town into hysteria. But grief is loud, and truth louder. By week's end, mothers repeated the tale in whispers, and children cried when lamps were snuffed at night. They said Elias had drawn the same figure on his widow's paper, wings outstretched, head bowed. They said the boy was not drawing what he imagined, but what was already in the room, what already leaned close over their children's beds. Elias's mother kept him indoors, shuttering the windows against prying eyes. But even then, the father claimed to see shadows lingering near their house, pale and faceless. He took to sleeping in the barn with a rifle across his knees, though he admitted later he did not know whether bullets would matter. No one dared confront Elias directly, but whenever he walked the dirt road, men stepped aside as though clearing space for a funeral procession. His mother walked faster, clutching his arm, while the boy himself never lifted his eyes. He only whispered softly, as though repeating some melody no one else could hear, and though his voice was faint, many swore the words were the same lullaby. Mary Ellen's mother had heard the night before her daughter's death. That was when the town began to believe the boy's drawings were not warnings, nor prayers, but invitations. They found him crouched in the loft one morning, his hands black to the wrists, nails rimmed with charcoal so deep it looked as though the dust had worked its way into his very flesh. His mother tried to scrub them clean with lye soap and scalding water, but the black would not lift, no matter how raw his skin turned. Neighbors who came to offer condolences for Mary Ellen saw his hands and recoiled, muttering that it looked like grave dirt clinging to him. Elias did not flinch beneath their stares. He simply cradled his quill, whispering words too soft to catch, his eyes fixed on the empty space above their shoulders, as if watching something they could not see. That week, another child was found lifeless in bed, her eyes wide, her mouth parted as though caught mid-song. Her mother claimed she had awoken to hear scratching on the window pane, though when her husband rose to look, nothing was there but a smear of black dust. At the funeral, someone whispered that Elias's hands were not stained by charcoal at all, but by touching the children he had drawn, as if he had pressed his fingers straight into the paper and pulled their breath away. The Reverend tried to silence such talk, but his own voice wavered when Elias came forward to lay a small folded page on the coffin. When the paper slipped free, the mourners saw the outline of another angel, its head bent low, its faceless surface gleaming against the morning light. Murmurs spread like fire through dry grass. Some swore they saw the outline shift, the wings trembling as though trying to unfold. By nightfall, the whispers turned to fear. A group of men knocked on Elias's mother's door, demanding to see the boy's hands for themselves. When she refused, they pushed inside. Elias stood at the table, his palms open. The nails were black, as if ink had seeped into the quick, and no water or knife could scrape it away. One man spat and declared it the mark of the devil. Another swore the stains looked like the bruised tips of feathers. His mother wept and tried to cover his hands with cloth, but Elias only stared at the men, silent and unblinking. That night, each man dreamed of faceless figures pressing close, wings beating against the rafters, their black fingers grazing the edges of the bed. They woke slick with sweat, the taste of ash in their mouths. By dawn, every one of them avoided the Whitlock house, yet their wives and children whispered that they could hear the scratching still, faint and steady, as though someone were dragging a nail across the very air. The stains on Elias's fingers darkened with each passing day, spreading toward his palms, and no one knew whether he was holding the charcoal anymore or whether the charcoal had begun holding him. The Reverend stood tall in the pulpit that Sunday, though the veins in his neck trembled as if his words weighed more than his body could bear. The church was filled beyond its pews, mothers clutching children close, fathers standing stiff with folded arms, every eye flicking toward the back, where Elias sat beside his mother. The boy's stained hands were hidden in his lap, but still, the congregation seemed unable to look anywhere else. The Reverend opened his Bible, yet for a long moment he did not read. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the boy and spoke with a voice that cracked like wood splitting. He said there were powers that came as light but brought darkness, gifts that seemed like blessings but reeked of curses. He warned that the devil often borrowed the shapes of angels, and that no true messenger of heaven came without a face. A murmur rippled through the room, as though the whole congregation exhaled at once. Elias's mother rose in protest, her cheeks blotched red, insisting her son was innocent, a quiet boy who harmed no one. But the Reverend's eyes, sharp and glassy, did not leave Elias. He said the boy had been marked, not by his own choosing, but by something that sought to use him as a vessel. He begged the townsfolk to guard their homes, to lock windows and doors, to keep their children near, for he feared the angels Elias drew were not content to stay on the page. At that, the air grew so heavy, it felt as though the wooden rafters might bend. Some wept softly, others bowed their heads, but no one argued. Elias sat still, his face pale, lips twitching as though forming silent words. Only his mother dared touch him, pressing her hand against his back in trembling defense. After the sermon, when the crowd spilled into the yard, the Reverend pulled Elias's mother aside. His voice dropped to a whisper, raw with urgency. He told her to burn every page, to break the quills, to bury the ink deep where no hand could reach it. He swore that if she did not, the town would do it for her, and she would lose her son in ways worse than death. She clutched Elias to her, her nails digging into his shoulder, but said nothing. The Reverend watched them walk down the road, the boy's head tilted as if listening to something the wind carried just for him. Later, the Reverend confessed to his wife that when he spoke from the pulpit, he thought he saw wings stirring in the shadows above Elias's chair, wings that bent and twisted like smoke rising from a grave. He prayed until his voice grew hoarse, yet the sound of that prayer followed him into his sleep, where faceless angels pressed their weight against his chest, whispering hymns he had never heard before. They gathered by firelight because no one trusted the darkness anymore. The townsfolk met in the clearing beyond the mill, where the smoke from their lanterns mingled with the smoke of torches, casting shadows that bent across the trees. Mothers clutched their children's hands tight, while men spoke low, their voices carrying the weight of dread they could not shake. The Reverend stood among them, his face pale as wax, his Bible pressed to his chest. They did not sing hymns that night. Instead, they read verses aloud, each voice joining the next in a desperate litany, meant to drive back whatever had begun creeping into their homes. But the prayers felt thin, swallowed by the hush of the woods. The only steady sound was the crackle of fire and the restless shifting of boots on the cold ground. Some swore they saw shapes at the tree line, tall and unmoving, as though something faceless watched from beyond the circle of light. No one dared to look for long, and still, within their circle, Elias sat cross-legged near the flame, his hands busy with paper. His mother had tried to keep him home, but when he slipped from her grasp and wandered toward the gathering, the crowd parted around him, as if some unseen current pushed them aside. He drew with unnatural speed, the quill darting across the widow's paper, his lips moving soundlessly. When his mother reached for him, her fingers brushed the page, and she recoiled as though burned. The angel there was unlike the others. Its wings arched over the entire sheet, black strokes so dense they seemed to shimmer like feathers in motion. Its faceless head tilted downward, gazing at the small circle of fire where they all Saturday. Someone shouted that he must stop. Another lunged as if to tear the paper from his grasp, but the Reverend raised his hand and bade them hold still. He stepped closer, voice trembling but firm, asking Elias, who had taught him to draw such things. The boy raised his eyes at last, dark and glassy, and whispered, "They teach themselves." His voice was so quiet that those at the edge of the fire claimed later they heard nothing at all, only the flicker of flames shifting with the sound. The Reverend took the page and thrust it into the fire. The parchment curled but did not blacken. Instead, the ink seemed to writhe, twisting in the heat like something alive. Only after the Reverend pressed it deep into the embers with his boot did it vanish into ash. But even then, a thin wail echoed through the clearing, high and hollow, carrying long after the fire snapped shut. Mothers pulled their children closer, and fathers gripped their torches, though none dared move. Elias only bent to his quill again, as if he had not stopped drawing at all, as if his hand followed a command no one else could hear. The widow's paper had grown scarce by midsummer, its stack thinning, though Elias seemed never to run short. His mother claimed she hid the remaining sheets beneath her mattress, yet somehow each morning more appeared upon the boy's desk, edges yellowed and curling, as if they had been waiting for years to be found. One evening, when the cicadas screamed so loud they made the air tremble, Elias sat by the hearth with a page that looked utterly blank. His mother, exhausted from another day of whispers and stares, seized it from him, declaring she would not watch her son sink deeper into this madness. She held the page to the lamplight and saw nothing but age-stained paper. Relief filled her chest for a moment, until Elias spoke. His voice was flat, without breath, as if borrowed from some place that had no lungs. "You're looking wrong," he said. Uneasy, she lifted the sheet nearer the flame, and then she saw it. The faintest outline emerged, not in ink but in shadow, as though the fire itself drew what her eyes should never see. Figures filled the page, tall and robed, their faceless heads bowing together in a circle that seemed to widen the longer she looked. Her hand trembled, but the paper felt heavy, thick with something more than pulp and fiber. She dropped it into the fire, yet it did not burn. The edges glowed dull red, the figures shuddered, and then the paper leapt free, as if spat out, landing on the hearthstone unmarked. Elias snatched it up and clutched it to his chest like scripture. That night, others in town reported strange things. A farmer swore his lantern flickered and went out, and in the brief dark he glimpsed a page drifting against his barn wall, covered in faint white forms. A seamstress claimed she opened her sewing chest and found a folded sheet lying atop her fabric, its surface empty until she held it near her candle, where wings bloomed like smoke. The Reverend himself, unable to sleep, watched the flame of his bedside lamp bend sideways, revealing a page he had never owned, inkless but alive, the faint shape of an angel's robe curling across it. He prayed until dawn, though the page dissolved like mist with the first light of morning. Back in the Whitlock home, Elias whispered to his mother that the angels had found another way to be seen. He pressed the blank page flat against the wall, and shadows bloomed outward from its edges, climbing like roots across the boards. She tried to pull him away, but his hands had fused to the sheet, and she swore she felt a heartbeat beneath it, steady as her own pulse. When at last she tore him free, the wall remained marked with gray streaks like wings stretching wide. From then on, no blank page in Fairhaven could be trusted. The schoolteacher of Fairhaven was not a man inclined to superstition, yet as the summer stretched long and breathless, his face grew gaunt, his eyes shadowed, as though sleepless nights had carved hollows into him. He kept his silence until one evening, after a meeting at the church, when he lingered behind with the reverend and confessed what had been clawing at his conscience. His voice shook as he spoke of a night weeks earlier, when he had returned to the schoolhouse to fetch his spectacles. The door groaned open, and the air inside was thick with the smell of ash and chalk, though no fire had burned. The slate at the front of the room, which he had scrubbed clean before leaving, was filled from corner to corner with drawings. They were not clumsy sketches of a boy's hand, but intricate forms, angels with wings so wide they seemed to press against the walls themselves, their robes trailing downward into lines that curled like roots, their faceless heads tilted toward the desks as though in judgment. The teacher swore he had not touched a piece of chalk, nor had any child. Yet the figures glimmered pale in the moonlight that slanted through the window, and when he stepped forward to wipe them away, the chalk did not smear. His rag passed across the surface without disturbing a single line. Terrified, he left them there and fled into the night. But when he returned at dawn with the sun sharp through the windows, the slate was bare once more, as if no hand, human or otherwise, had touched it. His confession hung in the room like smoke. The reverend pressed him for certainty, and the teacher only buried his face in his hands, saying he feared the drawings had been made by no child at all, but by the boards themselves. Word of his confession spread, carried by whispers from one household to another, and the tale took root. Some believed Elias had returned in the night to fill the schoolhouse walls with his angels, though none could explain how a boy so slight could reach so high or work so fast. Others muttered that the figures had not been drawn but revealed, as if the wood and plaster already held them, waiting for a moment when light and shadow would show their true shape. That week, parents began keeping their children home, fearful that the school itself had become tainted. By the time Sunday came again, half the benches in the classroom sat empty, dust settling where children once scuffed their shoes. The teacher, pale and trembling, stopped ringing the bell each morning, for he knew no one wished to answer it. In the stillness, he admitted to himself that he had heard something more that night, faint and hollow, a chorus of voices humming the same low lullaby the grieving mothers swore had drifted through their windows. And he knew then that Elias's hand was only the beginning, not the end. The corn grew tall that year, taller than it had any right to, the stalks heavy with ears that bent low, as though bowing beneath some unseen weight. Children were warned not to wander into the fields after dusk, yet warnings hold little sway over restless feet. One evening, a pair of boys returned home pale as milk, their mouths tight with terror. They swore they had heard voices rising from between the stalks, not the rustle of wind or the cry of night birds, but lullabies carried on air too still to move the leaves. The tune was slow and sorrowful, sung by a chorus that had no breath. When pressed, the boys said the sound came from nowhere and everywhere, circling them until their hearts near burst with fear. Within days, more children whispered of the same. Girls gathering water claimed they heard soft humming just beyond the fence, though no one stood there. A farmer's son dropped his bucket when a faceless figure seemed to lean between the stalks, its head cocked as if listening. The adults dismissed the tales at first, blaming imagination stoked by grief, but then came the night when Elias himself was found standing at the edge of the field, his hands lifted, fingers twitching in rhythm with the distant song. His mother dragged him inside, shaking him by the shoulders, demanding to know what he had been listening for. Elias only whispered, "They are learning to speak." The words chilled her blood, for the voice he used did not sound wholly his own. That week, Farmers found strange marks in the earth between the rows of corn, long sweeping arcs like wings dragging across the soil. Some swore the stalks bent in patterns that looked like circles of figures bowing together. The reverend gathered men to walk the fields with lanterns, but though they heard the humming themselves, faint and hollow, they found nothing but rustling shadows that scattered before their light. The corn seemed to sway without wind, closing in behind them, until the men stumbled out, drenched in sweat and unwilling to return. By then, the children of Fairhaven no longer played near the fields, for they said the voices called their names, stretching each syllable until it became unrecognizable, a mockery of human sound. At night, mothers barred their doors while the lullabies seeped through cracks in the walls. They prayed louder, yet the whispers threaded through every hymn. And always, when the voices grew near, Elias stirred in his sleep, his lips moving as though he were answering them. His mother pressed her hands over his mouth, but even then the words continued, a hollow echo rising from the boy's chest. Soon, no one doubted that whatever haunted the schoolhouse had stepped beyond its walls, taking root in the very earth, where even the corn bowed to listen. By late summer, Elias's mother could no longer endure the weight of the whispers that clung to every corner of Fairhaven. At the market, women turned their backs when she approached, clutching their baskets as though her shadow might spoil the bread inside. Children crossed themselves when Elias passed, their eyes darting away from his blackened fingers. Even the air inside her home felt thick, as if the very walls pressed closer with each passing night. She prayed until her knees ached, yet the sound of lullabies seeped through the windows, through the floorboards, through her son's lips as he slept. At last, desperation drove her to the reverend's door. She came barefoot in the dark, her dress torn at the hem, her hair unbound, clutching Elias's hand so tightly his knuckles whitened. She fell to her knees upon the threshold before the reverend could speak, her voice raw with grief. She begged him not to condemn her son, swearing Elias was only a boy with a strange gift, not a vessel of evil. She told him what she had hidden from the town. Elias had been born silent, his mouth open but no cry passing his lips. For 3 long years he never spoke, never babbled, never hummed. She feared him deaf, perhaps even touched in the head. Yet on his 3rd birthday, when he first drew an angel upon the wall with a shard of coal, he had turned to her and whispered his first word, "Listen." Since then, every word that left his mouth came soft and weighted, as if borrowed from some voice older than his own. She pleaded that he was not wicked, only chosen in ways she could not understand. The reverend stood above her, the candlelight trembling in his hand. His face was stern, but his eyes carried something nearer to pity than anger. He said, the Lord often tested his flock with burdens too heavy to bear, and sometimes those burdens took the shape of a child. He warned her again to burn the pages, to break the quills, to cast the ink into the river, where no hand could find it. Yet she shook her head wildly, for Elias clung to those things as if they were breath itself, and she feared taking them away might kill him faster than any curse. The reverend's wife appeared in the doorway, her face lined with worry, but the mother could not stop her weeping. She pressed her forehead to the reverend's boots, begging him to protect her son from the townsfolk, who she knew were sharpening their fear into something sharper still. The reverend did not lift her, only whispered that he would pray for the boy, though his eyes told her he believed prayer might not be enough. She rose at last, pulling Elias close, and as they left, the boy turned once more toward the reverend, his lips shaping a single word that carried too clearly in the silence. "Soon," he said, and the candles guttered low. It was the night when the church bells did not ring, though no hand had silenced them. The air itself felt weighted, heavy with a waiting dread that pressed against every roof and window. Mothers placed candles at the foot of their children's beds, 7 in all. A strange number whispered from lip to lip, though no one remembered who first spoke it. The flames wavered in unison, small islands of light in a sea of thick shadow. Outside, the town lay hushed, not even the owls daring to call. Just past midnight, the candles began to flicker, one by one, as if an unseen breath moved through the houses. In 7 different homes, mothers stirred awake to the faint sound of humming, a lullaby threaded with sorrow, too low and hollow to be human. They rushed to their children's rooms and found them lying pale and motionless, their eyes open to the ceiling, as though watching something just beyond sight. The candles burned steadily beside their small bodies, untouched by wax drips or smoke, but the children did not stir. By dawn, the wailing of mothers echoed through Fairhaven, rising like smoke into the gray sky. 7 coffins were built before the sun reached its peak, plain boxes hammered together with trembling hands. The men of the town carried them down the lane, their faces ashen, their steps uneven. The Reverend walked behind, clutching his Bible so tightly the pages creased, but his prayers caught in his throat like stones. In the midst of mourning, whispers grew louder, pointing toward the Whitlock house, for it was said that on the night of the 7 candles, Elias had been seen at his window, the faint glow of lamplight behind him, his hands moving swiftly across paper. A boy passing in the lane swore he saw 7 faceless angels sketched in quick succession, their wings bent low, their heads tilted as if waiting for command. When questioned, Elias's mother insisted he had been asleep, yet her eyes betrayed the truth. She had woken in the night to find him sitting upright, quill in hand, whispering to the blank air. The pages he filled had vanished by morning, though black dust lay scattered across the floor like spilled ash. At the funeral, when the 7 coffins were lowered into the ground, a sudden gust extinguished every torch, leaving the mourners in stunned darkness. Some claimed they saw shapes move among them in that brief moment, tall and robed, their faceless heads bowed in silence. When the flames sputtered back to life, Elias was standing apart from his mother, his eyes wide, his hands trembling, as though he had just released something into the world. And though no one spoke it aloud, all knew that what had happened was not an ending, but the beginning of something deeper, something that would not be contained by earth or prayer. The turning of Fairhaven did not happen with a shout, but with a silence so thick it seemed to crush the breath from the air. After the night of 7 candles, no one passed the Whitlock house without crossing themselves, and many no longer spoke Elias's name aloud. His mother kept him inside, shuttering the windows. But even so, the townsfolk claimed they saw his shadow move across the curtains at odd hours, the faint scratch of quill reaching the road like a nail drawn across stone. Fear hardened into resolve. Men who had once muttered at the mill now gathered openly in the square, their hands clenched around lantern poles as if they were weapons. The Reverend tried to calm them, warning that vengeance bred only ruin. Yet his voice wavered, and his words rang hollow, for even he could not deny the deaths that followed Elias's drawings. Mothers begged their husbands to act. Fathers clutched their sons close and swore the town would not bury another child. At dusk, they walked together up the lane, torches burning, their boots striking the earth in heavy rhythm. Elias's mother saw them coming from the loft window and pressed her son to her chest. Trembling, she begged him to stay quiet, to show them he was just a boy, but Elias only whispered that the angels were already near, their wings crowding the rafters. When the men reached the door, they did not knock. They shouted for the boy to be brought out, their voices rough with grief and terror, demanding the evil be cut from their midst before it swallowed them all. His mother barred the door with her body, crying out that he was her child, her only blood. But the crowd pressed forward, the heat of their torches searing the wood. From within the house came a sound that stilled them, not a scream, not the weeping of a woman, but a low humming, sweet and mournful, the same lullaby that had haunted their nights. It seemed to pour through the shutters, through the gaps in the boards, seeping into the marrow of every man who stood there, their torches guttered, though no wind stirred. One man dropped his lantern and stumbled back, his face pale as bone, whispering that he had seen something faceless peer through the crack in the door. The others faltered, for anger had carried them this far, but now it turned to dread. The Reverend stepped forward, his Bible lifted high, and declared that they must drive out darkness with light, but his words broke when Elias's voice rose behind the door, soft and sure, saying, "It is not darkness. It is promise." The crowd scattered then, leaving only the Reverend beneath the weight of that whisper. He lowered his Bible, his hands trembling, for he could not shake the feeling that Fairhaven had already chosen its side, and it was not his. The abandoned chapel sat at the far edge of Fairhaven, where the trees grew so thick their branches locked together and choked the Sunday. Its roof sagged, its steeple leaned, and ivy curled around its stone walls like veins feeding on a corpse. Once it had been a place of worship, but after the roof collapsed in a storm and the floor rotted through, the congregation left it to ruin. Now, dust and silence filled its pews, and the air smelled of damp wood and ash. It was here that Elias's mother led him after the town turned, clutching his hand so tightly her knuckles blanched. She thought the chapel might shield them, that its sacred stones might muffle the whispers that followed her son. They slept on a pallet by the altar, rats skittering in the rafters, the wind moaning through broken windows. For a time, the world outside seemed distant, but the safety she sought crumbled quickly. On the second night, she woke to a sound that did not belong to rats or wind. It was the scratching of quill on paper. Elias sat cross-legged on the chapel floor, his face pale in the flickering lamplight. The widow's paper spread around him. He was drawing again, his blackened nails dragging across the parchment with a speed that seemed more fever than craft. When she crept closer, her breath caught. The figures he drew were not confined to the page. They spilled across the stone floor, carved into the very slabs as though the quill were cutting rather than writing. Tall, faceless angels bent low over the pews, wings stretching along the walls, their shadows merging with the cracks in the plaster. She cried out and snatched the quill away, but Elias did not resist. He only looked at her with wide eyes, whispering that the angels liked the chapel, that they said it was empty and waiting. The next day, she tried to scrub the marks from the stone, but her rags shredded and her hands blistered while the lines remained sharp, as though etched by fire. That evening, when the sun slipped behind the trees, the chapel grew darker than any place she had known, darker even with a lamp burning beside her. She heard the creak of wood, though no one walked, the groan of pews shifting as if unseen bodies pressed against them. At times she swore the hymnal books fluttered their pages, though no wind stirred. She held Elias close and whispered prayers through chattering teeth, but his small voice rose against hers, not in prayer, but in reply to the whispers that crawled through the air. By the fourth night, the walls themselves had begun to change. New figures appeared upon the plaster, not drawn by Elias's hand, but blooming like mold in damp corners, their faceless heads turning toward the pallet where mother and son lay. She pressed her hands over his ears, begging him not to listen, not to answer, but Elias only smiled faintly, as if soothed, and whispered that the angels were grateful. The stranger came on a morning when the mist clung low over the fields, veiling the town in a gray so thick it seemed the world itself had forgotten how to wake. Elias and his mother were walking back from the river with a pail of water when they saw him standing at the roadside, a tall figure dressed in a coat too fine for Fairhaven, though dust and miles had worn it thin. His hat shadowed his face, yet when he lifted it in greeting, his features seemed both sharp and blurred, as if the eye could not decide where to settle. He spoke with a voice that carried like wind through hollow wood, asking if the boy was the one who drew angels. Elias's mother pulled him close, her heart thundering, but the stranger only smiled faintly, not with kindness, but with knowledge, as though the answer had been given before he asked. He knelt in the road so that his eyes met Elias's, and for a long moment the two simply stared. The boy's lips moved soundlessly, and the stranger nodded, as if hearing words no one else could. When the mother demanded to know what business he had, the man straightened and said he had come to explain what the Reverend could not. He claimed Elias was not cursed, nor mad, nor wicked, but chosen to draw what had already been promised. The angels, he said, were not his creations, but his revelations, and what was faceless now would soon wear the likeness of those who resisted them. The mother's blood chilled, yet Elias's eyes shone with something close to wonder, as if he had been waiting all along for someone to speak the truth aloud. She tried to pull him away, but the stranger reached into his coat and produced a single folded page, its surface pale as bone. He offered it to Elias, who took it with trembling hands. The page was blank to her eyes, yet Elias pressed it to his chest with a shudder, whispering that it was already full. The stranger tipped his hat once more and walked into the mist, his figure fading until it seemed the fog itself had swallowed him whole. No one in Fairhaven admitted to knowing him, though some claimed later they had seen him lingering near the graveyard weeks before, his shadow long against the stones. That night Elias drew until his fingers bled, the blank page never leaving his side. When his mother begged him to stop, he told her the angels had shown him what came next, that they were waiting for the town to see them clearly. His words filled her with terror, but also with the bleak certainty that the stranger at the roadside had not been a man at all, but a messenger come to ensure Elias kept drawing until Fairhaven could no longer look away. The burying ground of Fairhaven had once been a place of order, each headstone lined neat as soldiers, names carved deep so memory might hold against time. But after the night of 7 candles, when the earth claimed so many children, the town began to change its ways. No chisel struck stone, no name was given. The fathers dug graves with bowed heads. The mothers wrapped their little ones in cloth without speaking, and the coffins were lowered into soil without song. Only silence marked the resting place, and over each mound they scattered dirt until no trace remained. The reverend, pale and trembling, read no names, for there were none to read. He told the families it was better this way, that names called too loudly might draw attention, that stone marked too clearly might invite the faceless angels back to claim what they had already taken. Some wept, others nodded, but all obeyed, for fear had become the law stronger than scripture. Before long, the graveyard grew thick with unmarked earth, rows upon rows of forgotten humps that the wind smoothed over like waves. At night, when the candles burned low in houses across Fairhaven, some swore they heard the sound of wings rustling among those graves, as if something stirred beneath. A miller's wife, returning late from tending her sick mother, claimed she saw Elias himself standing there in the moonlight, a page of the widow's paper spread across one mound. His fingers moved in steady strokes, though no quill touched the sheet. She swore the lines rose on their own, forming the outline of a bowed angel, its faceless head tilted toward the soil. The next day, she fled the town with her children, never to return. Others whispered of black dust, carried on the wind, that settled only upon the burial ground, leaving streaks across the fresh mounds, as though marking them. One farmer, drunk with grief, defied the new custom and carved his son's name into a plank of wood, planting it firm in the earth. By morning, the plank had split down the middle, the letters warped into unreadable shapes. He tore it out and cast it into the river, and from that day forward, no one else dared to try. Elias's mother wept when she passed the graveyard, clutching her son as if she might shield him from what he had set in motion, but Elias did not look away. His eyes fixed on the unmarked ground, his lips moving faintly. When she pressed her ear close, she swore he whispered the names that had been denied, each one spoken clear and soft, as though writing them into air instead of stone. The silence that followed was worse than any hymn, for it seemed to belong not to the living, but to the faceless watchers waiting among the trees. It was on a night when the rain pressed against the chapel roof like 1,000 fingers that Elias first spoke of wings. His mother had curled herself beside the cold hearth, too weary to pray, while her son sat upright, staring at the rafters as though something perched there. His lips moved soundlessly at first, and she thought he was lost again in whispers that belonged to no one, until his voice grew louder, thin and strange, as if carried through a hollow reed. He told her the angels had wings larger than houses, wings that darkened the sky when they opened, wings heavy enough to bend trees, though no wind touched them. She begged him to stop, clutching her hands over her ears, but the words poured out, steady and calm, as though not his own. He said the angels could not find their faces, that they searched for them in the eyes of sleeping children, bending low over their beds to try them on like masks. He said they whispered to him that they had been faceless since the beginning, waiting for someone to draw the shapes that might hold them. His mother wept, trembling as she begged him to say no more. But Elias only smiled faintly, his blackened nails tapping the paper in his lap. He whispered that the wings brushed against him when he slept, that he woke with feathers in his mouth, soft as ash, tasting of dust and blood. When she tore the page from his hands, she froze. The drawing upon it was not of angels in their endless robes, but of a child curled in bed, its eyes wide and hollow, while vast wings folded protectively over its body. She recognized the quilt, the crooked beam above the bed, even the small window with its crack in the glass. It was their home, her son's own room, and the child in the bed was Elias himself. She tried to burn the page, but the damp firewood only hissed, and the paper refused to catch. She shoved it into the rain outside, but when she returned, Elias already held it again, dry and whole, as if it had never left his hands. That night, she lay awake, her arms tight around him, staring into the shadows that stretched across the chapel walls. More than once, she swore the darkness trembled like feathers, rising and falling with a breath not her own. Near dawn, Elias whispered that the angels had promised they would soon show her too, that their wings were not to be feared, only obeyed. His words chilled her blood, for though his lips moved, the voice that spoke through him did not sound like her son at all. The Reverend declared that enough was enough. On a gray morning, when the bells refused to ring, he called the townsfolk to the square and demanded the boy's sketches be destroyed before more lives were lost. Men arrived with shovels and pitchforks, women clutching rosaries so tight their knuckles whitened, children hidden behind skirts with eyes wide and fearful. Elias's mother came last, her son in tow, his arms wrapped around the stack of papers, as though holding his very heart. She pleaded with them not to take them, crying that the drawings were all he had, that without them he would wither like a plant denied water. But no one listened. They seized the pages, torn from Elias's hands with such force that his fingers bled. The widow's paper crackled as it was piled high, the ink shimmering darkly even in shadow as if it carried its own light. The Reverend raised his torch and thrust it down, and the crowd gasped when the flames leapt higher than seemed possible, roaring like a furnace unleashed. The sketches curled, the edges shriveling, yet the figures within did not vanish. Instead, the angels writhed as though alive, their wings twisting in the fire, their faceless heads tilting toward the crowd. Mothers screamed, fathers dropped their weapons, and even the Reverend faltered, his arm shaking as he pressed the torch deeper, the air filled with a shrill cry, thin as glass shattering, that rang from every page as though the angels themselves were screaming. Ash rose into the sky, swirling above the square, not gray but black, forming outlines of vast wings that blotted out the sun for a heartbeat. Some swore they felt feathers brush their faces, though when they touched their cheeks, they found only streaks of soot. At last, the flames died, leaving nothing but a heap of scorched fragments. But when the smoke cleared, the crowd saw that the cobblestones beneath were marked with black impressions, dozens of faceless figures stamped into the stone itself, their wings spread wide as if guarding the place. Elias stood silent, his cheeks streaked with tears, his hands raw and shaking. His mother clutched him to her chest, glaring at the townsfolk as though daring them to touch him again. The Reverend, pale and trembling, declared the fire a holy cleansing, though his voice rang hollow and the crowd muttered uneasily. For though the pages had burned, something darker had been released. That night, when the townsfolk returned to their homes, they found ash drifting through their windows, settling on cradles, on pillows, on the faces of sleeping children. The air stank of iron, and faint scratching echoed through the rafters. The angels had not been destroyed. They had been freed. The silence came slowly, like fog rolling down from the hills, until Fairhaven seemed wrapped in a hush that smothered every sound. The mill wheel turned without creak, the river slid by without ripple, even the roosters crowed without voice, their beaks opening to nothing. At first, the townsfolk thought it a blessing, a reprieve from the whispers and lullabies that had haunted their nights. But silence carried its own terror. No hammer rang on anvil, no dogs barked at the gate, no laughter of children reached the air. The town seemed hollow, as though sound itself had been swallowed. In this strange stillness, Every ear strained for what was missing, and in straining, they began to hear something else. A faint scratching lingered beneath the quiet, so soft it might have been mistaken for breath. It came from the walls, from the floorboards, from the earth itself. Mothers pressed their palms against the cradles and felt the hum of it, as though the silence had become a living thing. Men walked the lanes at dusk, their lanterns swaying, and swore the shadows of faceless figures stretched across the cobblestones, though no one walked beside them. The reverend rang the church bell to gather the town, but the rope swung in his hands without sound, the iron mouth gaping mute. Still, they came, drawn together by fear, their faces pale and expectant. Elias stood among them, his eyes wide, his lips moving, though no sound passed. Yet the people swore they heard him, not in their ears but in their bones. A voice that told them the angels had claimed the air, that silence was the proof of their nearness. His mother clung to him, whispering prayers that no longer reached her own ears. That night, the town lay under a sky so still, the stars seemed frozen. In every home, candles burned low, but not a single match struck could be heard, nor a single flame crackle. Families sat with hands clasped, their breathing shallow, waiting for something to break. And then, just before dawn, the silence shuddered. Windows rattled, walls groaned, and in the quiet came a single sound, the faint flutter of wings, vast and countless, rising above the roofs. It was not heard in the way sound is heard, but felt, deep in the chest, a tremor that made hearts stumble and blood run cold. The silence returned after, heavier than before, leaving the people trembling in their homes. Fairhaven had become a place where words no longer carried, where prayer died on the lips, and where only the boy with blackened hands seemed able to speak. The mirror stood in the corner of the chapel, its glass clouded with age, its wooden frame cracked and eaten by worms. Elias's mother had draped a cloth across it long ago, fearing what the boy's eyes might find if left unchecked. But one night, she woke to the sound of the fabric sliding to the floor. Elias knelt before the mirror, his small body rigid, his head tilted, as though listening to something within the glass. At first she saw nothing but his pale reflection, the smudges of charcoal on his cheeks, the restless twitch of his fingers. Then the lamplight flickered, and the reflection changed. Where his face should have been, there was only blankness, a smooth expanse like paper waiting for a quill. Behind him, wings unfurled in silence, vast and dark, brushing against the corners of the frame, though no such wings filled the room. She cried out and rushed forward, but Elias lifted a hand, pressing his palm to the glass. His reflection did the same. But where his fingers should have been smudged and blackened, the hand in the mirror was pale and long, the nails sharp as quills. The glass trembled, humming low, and for a heartbeat she thought the reflection might step forward and leave Elias behind. She tore him away, clutching him against her chest. But the mirror did not return to what it had been. The faceless figure remained, its wings shifting faintly, its head bowed toward them as if waiting. From that night onward, the mirror grew restless. Its surface no longer showed the room, but pale outlines that drifted across the glass, like shadows swimming beneath ice. At times, Elias would glance toward it and smile faintly, as if seeing a friend. His mother begged the reverend for guidance, and he urged her to smash the glass. Yet when she lifted a stone to it, her hand froze midair, her reflection staring back with no eyes, no mouth, no face. She dropped the stone, weeping, for she knew then that the mirror no longer belonged to her. Rumors spread quickly, for the few who stepped into the chapel claimed they saw their own reflections turn faceless, their mouths moving in silence, their eyes hollow pits. One woman swore she saw a pair of wings unfold behind her own reflection, blotting her from sight. The townsfolk stopped coming near, leaving mother and son to the haunted place. Elias whispered that the angels were closer now, that the mirror was their doorway, that soon they would not need him to draw their shapes because they had found their own. His mother clutched him tightly, but even as she held him, his eyes drifted again toward the glass, where the faceless angel mirrored his every breath. The storm came first, rolling over Fairhaven with thunder that shook the ground and lightning that split the sky in jagged white scars. Rain poured down in sheets, but even its pounding seemed muffled, as though the silence that had strangled the town had learned to swallow even the voice of heaven. On that night, when mothers bent low over their children and fathers barred their doors, the faceless came. They moved through the streets in a procession that stretched farther than sight, tall robed figures gliding over the mud without leaving prints, their wings unfurled and folded in unison, the movement soundless, like shadows breathing. Each one carried its head bowed, faceless surfaces reflecting the flicker of lanterns left burning in windows. From every home, people watched in terror, too afraid to breathe, too afraid to call for help. Some said the figures passed through walls, as if wood and stone were air, entering houses and pausing beside beds. Wherever they lingered, children grew still, their breath caught, their eyes wide and glassy. When the faceless turned away, the children did not stir again. The Reverend braved the storm, clutching his Bible as he staggered into the lane, and he cried out words of scripture, though the rain drowned them. The figures did not falter. One turned its blank head toward him, and he dropped to his knees, the words stuck in his throat, his voice stolen, as though swallowed by the silence they carried. He clutched his chest, gasping without sound, until at last he collapsed upon the stones. Those who saw it dared not step out to help, for they swore more figures pressed against their windows, their faceless heads turning toward the smallest stir of movement. In the chapel, Elias stood at the mirror, his reflection gone, replaced by an angel so vast its wings filled the glass. His mother begged him to look away, but he whispered that the angels were walking now, that Fairhaven had been chosen as their path. The glass trembled with each silent step of the procession outside, the faceless moving like an endless funeral march. Some townsfolk fled into the fields, but the corn bent low, the stalks closing around them, and they did not return. By dawn, the storm had passed, the streets washed clean, but Fairhaven was not the same. Windows stood open, beds lay empty, and 7 more graves waited in the earth without names. No one spoke of it in daylight, but all knew the town had been broken, its voice taken, its children thinned. And always, when dusk came again, shadows stretched too long across the lanes, as though the procession of the faceless had never truly left, only circled until night called them forth again. The morning after the procession, the chapel was colder than the graveyard itself. Elias's mother woke to find the boy sitting before the mirror, his quill scratching furiously across a page that seemed to swell and stretch beneath his hand. His face was pale, his eyes ringed with shadows, his lips moving in time with the strokes, whispering words she could not hear. She rushed to him, but when she touched his shoulder, he did not stir. It was as if the hand that guided the quill was not his own. The paper grew darker with each line, the figure upon it rising larger and larger until it filled the page, wings spanning its edges, its faceless head bowed. Yet, when the final stroke was drawn, Elias froze. The angel on the page lifted its head, and for the first time there was a face, not blank, not smooth, but the face of her son. The likeness was so perfect it stole her breath, his eyes wide, his lips parted, but with a stillness that no living child could hold. Elias slumped forward, the quill dropping from his fingers. She screamed his name, shaking him, but his body was limp, his chest unmoving. The page trembled on the floor, the ink wet and glistening as though alive. She tried to tear it, but her hands recoiled as if the paper burned her. The face upon it seemed to breathe, the eyes staring past her into the room itself. Shadows deepened across the chapel walls, spreading like wings until they swallowed the rafters. She clutched her son's body, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers that fell dead into the silence. Outside, Fairhaven stirred in unease. The bell rope swung in the church tower, though no hand pulled it, and the air filled with the hollow sound of wings unseen. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces ashen, staring toward the chapel, where black dust began to drift from the broken windows. Some fled, others fell to their knees, but no one dared approach. Inside, Elias's mother pressed her lips to his hair, begging him to wake. But the boy was gone. The page lay between them, the angel's wings now stretching beyond the borders of the paper, bleeding into the stones beneath, its face identical to his own. As dawn broke, the glass of the mirror shattered, spilling shards across the floor, each one catching the light and reflecting the same faceless figures bending low in silence. The last drawing remained unburned, untouched, as if the fire of the world itself could not consume it. In time, Fairhaven would bury more children in graves without names, and mothers would whisper that they had seen Elias walking the lanes at dusk, his hands blackened, his eyes hollow, carrying his final page beneath his arm. Comment the oldest town in your country, and if you want more stories that whisper long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.